Well, it looks like the rate at which people are joining is leveling off, so we will go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen Campbell, and I am Executive Director of PACE, Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. I'm going to kick us off with a couple notes of very brief housekeeping. First of all of our attendees today are muted by default, but you can unmute yourself at any time when you are ready to speak. And you just do that by looking at the top bar of the webinar screen. There should be a little picture that says mic. And so you unmute that and you should be ready to speak. We will have a Q&A portion of today's discussion, so we hope that you all will utilize that. Second is there is a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to utilize that in order to share comments and questions with the presenters and with each other. Also, on some of our past webinars, participants have found it particularly a helpful opportunity to share resources with each other. So links to websites or reports that are of topics that might be of interest to other attendees on the call. The final note of housekeeping is that this discussion is being recorded and a video will be made available on our website probably tomorrow. We'll be able to get that up, but this discussion is being recorded today. So with that, I think that's all in terms of housekeeping. So I will go ahead and kick off our discussion. So for those who are not familiar with PACE, we are a network of foundations and funders that seek to understand the importance of civic engagement and democratic practice and why we believe this worthy of philanthropic investment. We are membership-based and we convene our members to share learning and discussions that help advance their work. We also venture to provide a platform for our members to share their work with a broader audience, and that's a big piece of what brings us here today. With the 2016 election just a few months away, there is certainly and rightly a lot of discussion and sometimes debate about the role social sector organizations can and should be playing in order to encourage participation in electoral processes. What we wanted to do with this webinar today was to help advance this dialogue by bringing resources and discussions and research of PACE members and partners to bear in this discussion. So today, I'm pleased to introduce you to Kelly Bourne of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and Brian Miller of Nonprofit Vote. For those who explored the advanced readings that were recommended for today's webinar, you are likely already aware that Kelly and many of her colleagues were instrumental in launching a 15-part blog series in the Stanford Social Innovation Review titled Increasing Voter Turnout, It's Tougher Than You Think. And Brian and his team have commissioned some very interesting and powerful research about the impact of nonprofit voter outreach on client and community turnout, particularly for low propensity or first-time voters. So how we will spend our time today is learning a bit more about each of these efforts and then engaging in a discussion about what they might mean, what these findings might mean for all of our work. So I've asked each Brian and Kelly to present a little bit on their projects and what they've learned from them. I have a few questions to help kick off our discussion, but then we also have plenty of time for Q&A. So please get your questions ready. Again, you can utilize the chat box feature to do that as we go along. You don't have to wait until that portion opens up. So submit them anytime and we'll get a queue started. And then you can also ask them yourselves when we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Kelly, let's start with you. You and the Hewlett Foundation have partnered with SSIR to explore various strategies that philanthropy and nonprofits could take to increase voter engagement. And many of those strategies seem to be at a systems level. Can you give us a high-level view of the opportunities and challenges of voter engagement as it relates to involvement of nonprofits and philanthropic institutions?
Yeah, well, I'm at least happy to try. So thank you, Kristen, for bringing this together, and for everyone on the line for joining. I think this should be a fun conversation. So, Kristen, as you know, we've been at Hewlett looking at issues around voter engagement and voter turnout for the last couple of years. I should say, preface that by saying nonpartisan voter turnout. And this has been part of our work around the Madison Initiative, which is what Hewlett calls our democracy work. And the focus of that work is really squarely around improving conditions in Congress and looking at voter turnout and voter engagement as a mechanism for doing that. But I think all of the questions that we've grappled with around the role of philanthropy here vis-a-vis other political actors and the feasibility of different kinds of interventions are relevant for anybody who's looking at improving voter turnout. So I pulled together a couple of slides, which I'll pull up quickly, that kind of chart our journey of exploration over the last few years. And I would say we began by looking at questions around the role of philanthropy and whether or not how philanthropy was positioned to make a difference here, given how many other actors are also working to improve turnout. And so the first thing we looked at was, well, how much activity is happening in this space already? And by my last count, looking at Foundation Center data, there's been about $250 million invested by philanthropy to support voter education, registration, access, and turnout, cumulatively over the last 5 years. So anywhere between 30 to 100 million a year, depending on where we are in the election cycle. And it's pretty broad-based work. So 200 foundations, 1,300 grants to 500 nonprofits, really quite a lot of philanthropic activity here and nonprofit activity. But that really pales in comparison to the $10 billion that's forecasted to be spent by parties and candidates and interest groups in the 2016 election cycle alone. So 100 million juxtaposed with annually an election year compared to 10 billion. So it raised for us, I think, real questions around what role can we meaningfully play here vis-a-vis these other actors. Then the next thing that we started looking at was around feasibility and just looking at U.S. voter turnout over time to try and get a sense of what kind of impact seems likely given longitudinal trends. And what you see here is a chart of turnout going back to the 1780s through today. And what struck me was that looking basically around 1970, sort of post-civil rights, structural and cultural transitions, you really see things leveling off to be hovering around 30 to 40% in midterms and 50 to 60% in generals and presidentials. And it's been pretty consistent, although there are big peaks and troughs depending on how charismatic a candidate is. But that raised questions for me of the feasibility of really dramatically increasing turnout in the U.S. And we also looked at it from a comparativist perspective at other advanced democracies and what their turnout levels look like. And the upshot was that the United States is pretty middle of the pack for OECD countries, particularly for those countries that either don't have a current or recent history of mandatory voting, like Italy and Australia, where you just see much higher turnout, or smaller countries where the feasibility of impact of an individual vote is perceived to be higher. So for the most part, we found that the U.S. wasn't that far behind other advanced democracies with similar characteristics, which again provokes this question of where and how could philanthropy meaningfully intervene. And so that was what prompted the inquiry, Kristen, that you mentioned, where I reached out to about a dozen experts in the field, a lot of academics, particularly those that are sort of foremost in the voter experimentation space, but also private sector and public actors, everyone from the head of public affairs at MTV to former secretaries of state, and then other funders who have a lot of experience in this space. Because I'm not a voting expert, it was really helpful to basically ask each of them to pitch their best ideas for how to improve turnout. And at the end of the series, after looking through all of these ideas, I would say I came away with three big takeaways, which I'll just touch on very quickly here. One was that there just didn't seem to be a silver bullet, which was a disappointment, but that there are a handful of potential interventions on both the structural and cultural front, but most of them offer opportunities to improve turnout by a couple of percentage points. On the structural front, the sort of holy grail would be automatic voter registration, or some permutations about election day registration, portable registration. And most experts, all experts, agree that you could see there something like 2 to 9 at best percentage points increase in turnout, which would be huge. I mean, that would be the biggest structural intervention that one could hope for, that would still be sort of in the single digits around turnout increases, which would be great, but it's still in single digits. And then I think David Becker from the series at Pew said it best, or in a way that really resonated with me. He had Pew's election project and said, turnout voting has never been easier since basically World War II, and yet we're not experiencing huge increases there. So it really brought to question for me whether these kinds of avenues of easing the barriers or making it simpler to vote would necessarily get us there. So then you look at cultural interventions, mostly GOTV efforts, and here the experts on the experimentation there at Yale basically concurred that you can typically see 1 to 2 percentage points increase from a lot of standard GOTV efforts, and those have to be done year in and year out versus sort of a one-time structural reform. So that raised questions for me as well, but then I think Brian will have some really interesting points about potential cultural interventions that can have a higher impact than that. And then the last things I would say really quickly is that looking at all of that, 2 things stuck out to me as potentially good intervention points for the nonprofit sector. First, around improving the representativeness of the electorate. And I won't talk about that because I know that Brian will speak more to it, but I think it's an area where the parties and interest groups are not necessarily uniquely interested to intervene, and where philanthropy might have more of a distinctive role. And then primary elections, which I have been very interested in exploring. And so I'll talk really quickly about that. I just have 2 slides on that front. And here, we've come to appreciate that in most districts, they're no longer competitive. So the chart that you see here are the number of safe districts over time, right? And so red and blue you can see going up quite considerably. These are all safe congressional districts. And then the number of swing districts has gone down to the point where there are only about 20% of districts where the general election really matters. And for all of the other ones, the primary election has become the de facto general. So I know, living in Santa Cruz, that I'm going to have a Democratic representative, and the question is just really where on the ideological spectrum that representative will fall, and that's determined in the primary elections. And the challenge with that is that turnout in primaries is pretty low. It ranges between 5 to kind of 8% of in congressional primaries of the voting eligible population. And of course, these are not voters who are perfectly representative of America at large. They tend to be more ideological. And then whatever candidate they select in the primary goes on to become the de facto winner of the general election. And this is an area where parties have very clearly underinvested, and there are a lot of scholars here who have talked about why, but it strikes me as another area where philanthropy would be really uniquely positioned to intervene. I know Brian has similar thoughts, so I'll look forward, I'll stop there, but I'll look forward to hearing more from him on that front.
That's great, Kelly. Thank you so much. So yeah, Brian, let's shift to you a little bit. Your group has done a bunch of research on the efficacy of nonprofit voter registration efforts. What has your data found about what works on the ground, particularly those cultural pieces that Kelly was mentioning, or the representation pieces that Kelly was mentioning? And what are some strategies that you have seen work and be really meaningful?
Sure. Well, first off, I want to thank Kelly for some of the pieces that she brought up, because I think we basically agree and we concur with a lot of the points, and it's a healthy skepticism that, at the end of the day, we are not going to fundamentally change overall voter turnout. Nonprofits just aren't that big enough. And the scale of money we're putting into this pales in comparison, as Kelly said, to the scale of money that that nonprofits, are putting into this. And which then raises the question, what can nonprofits do that would be of value to this? And I think Kelly hit on the point of representativeness. And that's really the niche where we believe that nonprofits can make a valuable difference. We're not going to fundamentally change the overall voter turnout in the country. We're not going to fundamentally change that trend line. But what we can have an impact on is the gaps between who votes and who doesn't. And when I say representativeness, what obviously I'm talking about is the gaps between particularly, low income, high income, younger folks, older folks, educated, less educated voters, and Latino, Asian American voters, and white voters, and these gaps along the lines of race. And these are well documented gaps. They've been going on for many years in the country, and they seem like an institutional part of our organizational culture, and that is a cultural thing that just doesn't change. But I think there's significant evidence that it can and does change. And one of the most telling bits of evidence out there is that the gap between Black voter turnout and white voter turnout is almost gone right now. That's something that has changed dramatically over the last few decades. A lot of folks aren't aware of that. But if you held income and wealth, income and education level constant, actually Black voter turnout exceeds that of white voter turnout. And that, I argue, is in part at least a result of a lot of work that's happened over several decades. So these dynamics are not permanent fixtures of our political system, but the gaps do distort our political debates. They distort the policy options that are on the table because the voice of traditionally marginalized communities is just not represented. And when folks don't vote, candidates don't go to their districts to ask, hey, what do you think? Because they're not after their vote. But the real question is what is it that actually drives these voter participation gaps? And there's a lot of differing opinions, I would say. And I think a lot of folks who would look to structural reforms that could change it. Maybe if we pass election day registration, maybe we pass automatic voter registration. If we get rid of felony prohibitions against voting, which some states still have, most states don't. And if we do some of these structural reforms, then we can close these gaps. And I think the evidence on that is actually quite mixed. What we found is that even the most voter-friendly states, even states that already have election day registration, that allow young folks to pre-register, they still have significant gaps between who votes and who doesn't. Things like election day registration do increase overall voter turnout. That's well documented. It's several percentage points. It's one of the more promising reforms, along with probably automatic voter registration once we start seeing data on that front. But there isn't a lot of evidence that it narrows or closes the gap. And in some cases, there's evidence that it actually deepens the gap. Because in some cases, the people who take advantage of these easier registration laws are educated, middle-income folks who say, oh, hey, I can register now after this date. Great. But I think what we come to is there's other factors. And we argue that really what's driving these participation gaps is gaps in who is and is not being contacted about elections. In essence, voter participation gaps mirror broad trends in voter engagement. And I'm going to skip over to this next slide here. And if you look at this, they do these surveys after a lot of elections. And this is one here is from the American National Election Studies. And they did a poll of voters and asked them, hey, were you contacted by either party about voting? And as you can see, older folks were 3 times as likely to receive a phone call or some kind of contact about the election in 2012. There's been similar data from 2014 drawn along the lines of race. The Latino Decisions and Asian American Decisions election eve polls showed that 55 and 56% of Latinos and Asian Americans respectively were not contacted about the election in the 2014 cycle. And there's a reason for that. And I think if you put yourself in the mind of someone who's running a political campaign or running a political party, their agenda, as Kelly said, is fundamentally different. Their goal is to win elections. They have a limited amount of resources to do that. And so they're going to allocate those resources accordingly. They're not going to spend a whole lot of money sending mailers to folks who don't have a track record of voting. They're going to focus that voter outreach, that GOTV, that registration drives on communities that have some history of voting, generally 50% or better likelihood of vote in the propensity score that they have. And it's just an economic decision that they have to make. There was a powerful story. A woman who was running for city council here in Boston told me when she was out and she was talking to her campaign manager about, I want to go knock on the doors in this neighborhood and talk to folks about voting. And it was a low-income Asian American community. She was Asian American herself, and she felt like she wanted to make sure this community was represented. And her campaign manager gave her a real strong speech that there's one thing you're not going to get more of in this campaign, and that's time. And if you spend your time knocking on those doors, that's less time you have to knock on folks who actually have a track record of voting. And I just lost my video here. Let me jump that back in. There we go. Sorry about that. I think we're back. There we go. Okay. So, which brings us to what's going on here, and it becomes part of a vicious cycle. That basically people don't vote. For whatever reason, they don't vote. Because they don't vote, they're labeled in the voter files as low propensity voters. Then political campaigns, parties, and other entities make decisions on where they spend their money, and they choose not to spend money contacting folks who don't have a track record of voting. And because they're not contacted, they don't vote, and we come full circle. And it becomes a negative feedback loop. And so what we essentially argue is that nonprofits are well positioned to make a difference here. Nonprofits, first off, have a fundamentally different agenda. The agenda of nonprofits in many cases is to empower communities. It is to develop leadership, regardless of who people vote for. Secondly, nonprofits have deep roots in the community. They have trust. They have long-term relationships. This isn't a one-and-done campaign thing. This is where you've been dropping your kid off for after-day programs for years. And nonprofits often have the cultural competency to have that impact. If it's in an Asian American community, they're going to speak any number of languages. Same with Latino communities. And so we wanted to look further. We didn't want to we wanted to really evaluate, does this really have an impact? So we've done this a couple of years in a row, or a couple of cycles in a row. In 2014, we looked at the work that 120 nonprofits did across 9 states. And in this study, which we did in conjunction with Circle at Tufts, we compared both the demographic profile and the voter turnout rates of the 30,000 people that were contacted through these nonprofits. Actually, it was 40,000, but we used the data for 30. And comparable groups of voters across the same 9 states. And the first thing that we found out, which is not a huge surprise, is that the folks that are reached by nonprofits are the very communities that we need to reach if we're going to close participation gaps. They're 3 times as likely to be under 30 years, or twice as likely, to be under 30 years of age, 3 times as likely to be Black or Latino, 4 times as likely to have incomes under $25,000. But more importantly, or equally importantly, is that when those nonprofits make contact with those voters, they do have a significant impact on turnout. Now, again, the impact on overall turnout isn't that much. It's maybe 3 percentage points, 4 percentage points. When you break it down by slices, as you can see, we have a much larger impact among low propensity voters. In this case, those with incomes below 25,000 saw a 9-point increase, or turned out at 9 points higher than comparable voters in these states. Those with incomes over 50,000 had turned out at 2 points higher. So the biggest increases are among those least likely to vote. And in this case, that's really a 30% increase if you look at it that way. And this is the same graph broken out by propensity scores. And again, as you can see, those low propensity voters, they're still low propensity. You still only had 18% turnout to vote, but that's over twice the rate they would have turned out had these nonprofits done nothing. And so I think, and a lot of this data is from the Engaging New Voters report, which was in that email that folks got in advance of this call. But we can send out this data afterwards. But I think what this tells me and what this tells us, again, going to the things that Kelly was talking about, is that we're not going to change the fundamental turnout rate overall, but we can have an impact when we really think about who we're reaching out to those target demographics and narrowing the gaps. And I think at this point, we're going to pause for some discussion. I'll close off this slide. And so, Kristen, back to you.
Great, thanks. So we are getting a couple of questions coming in on the chat, which is great. So please keep sending them in. You can send them broadly, or you can send them privately to presenters, and we'll put those in a queue. So thanks for those who have submitted so far. I just want to kick us off with a little bit of a question around challenges and solutions. So starting with the challenges, you both identified a number of challenges in this space, gaps in the demographics of who participates, the feedback loops and how those need to be broken. But can you, are there any other challenges that you feel are important to elevate, or tough questions that the social sector needs to ask when thinking about our engagement and voter participation? Kelly, maybe or Brian, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think on the challenges front, the other one that I've wrestled with, we've hit on most of the ones that I mentioned around sort of impact and feasibility and the role of different actors. I think the other one is around just the cost of the interventions, particularly the cultural interventions, and really better understanding return on investment there. And I've seen some data on this front. I think more research and more openly available research would be helpful. So the organizations that have done it are typically the parties, and they're not sharing that information. But I have seen interesting data that cannot be publicly shared around the return on investment of mailers vis-a-vis, going door to door versus emails versus phone calls. And I think at least for philanthropy, when we're funding these interventions, really understanding how much it takes to get someone to register. And then even once you get them registered, how big a fall off there is there between registration and turnout, because just getting to registration, often that doesn't translate. And so the kinds of interventions that actually do translate from registration to turnout tend to be much of a heavier lift and requiring more in-person engagement of the kind that Brian is talking about. But understanding the cost there, I think, is the question.
That's a great point, Kelly. And I just want to elevate one of the questions that came in from chat, which might be helpful on this as well. Brian, it's specifically directed to you, so maybe you can answer this before you get into the challenges. But when you say contact by nonprofits, what kind of contact do you mean, and what has been the most effective? Is it phone calls or mailers or door knocking, interventions of religious institutions? What has really worked? And so maybe that factored into your response about additional challenges would be helpful.
Sure. I think, first off, the type of contact that we're talking about is, in our study, we looked at primarily service providers, nonprofit service providers, food pantries, community health centers, housing clinics, CDCs, groups that do reentry programs. What happens when they integrate voter engagement into their day-to-day client outreach or community outreach activities? So that in a lot of examples, we're talking about people doing tabling in the lobby of a community health center, or doing registration or registration as part of a citizenship ceremony, and basically integrating it into programs that groups already have in working with the communities that they're working with. And because of that, it's really hard to extract cost, because it's all embedded. It's not like mailers where you mailed this many people or whatever, because it's integrated with the program activities. That said, I do think, and I've seen some it's one of the numbers we're trying to get to is this cost. That if you're looking at the cheapest way to register people, it's not the cheapest way to register people. I think. But the things that are really cheap, things like direct mail, they're really cheap for registering low-hanging fruit, meaning, folks who might have registered as movers, generally educated, white, et cetera, voters. But if your goal is to really register marginalized communities, low-income, young folks, then I think we become far more cost competitive and actually cheaper. But again, we're not talking about groups coming in saying they want to register X number of people. What we're talking about is a community health center saying they value civic engagement among the communities that they're working with. And so, again, it can be cost competitive if the denominator you're looking at is low propensity voters. Then it's very cost competitive. But again, what we're really saying is that we want this to be built into the culture of the way nonprofits work. And so a lot of our work is about, building it into the institutions, that it's not just something that parachutes in during election season. It's something this health center does every cycle. Every cycle they get in the habit of, oh, we're going to set up this table in the lobby. Oh, what are we doing this year? Oh, we're going to set up the table at the health fair or whatever, that it becomes part of their general way they operate. And again, it's an important vehicle for really reaching these communities and closing the gaps. It's not going to change overall turnout, but it can narrow the gaps. I think on the other challenge, and I'll point to this, which I think Kelly pointed to when she mentioned the primaries, is recognizing, and I think this is one of the advantages to a lot of the groups we're working with. A lot of them are tied in with local issues. If it's a CDC, city councils have a huge impact on their work, because that's where things like, what percentage of affordable housing the city's going to designate gets determined. And so a lot of them end up working and doing voter engagement work, not just tied to presidential years where you're overwhelmed by all this other campaign money, but in municipal elections and local city council elections, they're doing voter engagement work. And that's really a sweet spot for nonprofits, because it's a place where they're not going to get as swamped with outside money.
So, Brian, you started mentioning a little bit about integrated voter engagement at places like community clinics or food pantries. We have a question that just came in about, is there data correlating how or where people register to vote and whether or not they actually turn out to cast a ballot?
Again, the work that we're doing is not just registration. We have a model that when they come through the door, we ask them, are you registered? If they are registered, yes, we register them. But if they're not, if they're not registered, we register. But if they're not, then we move to a voter pledge card or a civic engagement card or something like that. And we also encourage our partners to send communications in the lead up to elections. Registering people by themselves isn't sufficient. You do need some ongoing communications with folks. You need follow-up. If we're really going to have an impact. And again, we also need to not overlook folks who are already registered. One of the things that our study did document is a significant bump in turnout when we engaged folks who were already registered and just got them to sign a pledge to vote card. That alone had a significant impact in turnout. So I think we need to look at the toolbox as much bigger than just registering people when we do this. It's part of a broader engagement strategy.
Sure.
If I can chime in there, I completely agree, Brian, with what you said. And we actually conducted a literature review of about probably close to 20 academic articles that had done different experimentation and research on this front. And I think the consensus was similar to what Brian has articulated, which is things like motor voter registration at the DMV. It really depended on how that was implemented. And if DMV workers just checked the box, often people didn't even know that they were registered or didn't fully appreciate what the next steps were, versus a sort of deeper engagement of explaining. And so there's a lot of data around what intervention for registration actually turn out.
Right. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because I do think, while I think most of our folks are very supportive of the move towards automatic voter registration. I think it's going to suffer from that same challenge. If you're automatically registered, that, at the end of the day, you need a human face looking at you saying, your opinion matters. We value what you think, and you need to be a part of the process. We want to help you be a part of the process. That you really need that human intervention, that face-to-face interaction to really get people to vote. Automatically registering people is a great policy for getting over some of the hurdles that shouldn't be there. But at the end of the day, you still have to have that face-to-face engagement.
Yeah, definitely. Is that sounding off to you guys?
Yeah, I'm having the same one. Maybe if everyone else could. I'll put myself on mute.
Yeah, Kelly, I'm hearing it. Oh no. Let's see. Let me check the audio. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Your line is now unmuted.
I can, and I'll just mute my line when I'm not talking, just in case if that's a cause.
Okay. Oh, doing it again. Oh, I guess we're good now. Okay. Let's hope that holds out. Thanks you guys for your patience. So speaking of the toolbox, Brian, that you mentioned, we need many suites of tools to address certain issues. Can each of you offer a couple of ideas that you have on how philanthropy might go about encouraging voter engagement more broadly? What other tools would you recommend exist in the toolbox? Either ones that currently are there that we could pick up a little bit more often and use a little bit more, or tools that maybe we need to purchase and have in our civic toolbox, so to speak.
Sure, and
your line is now unmuted.
And I think I've actually got a few slides to get. I know some of these started, but Kelly, if you want to throw out some stuff before I throw these slides up, by all means.
Yeah, I would say I'm hearing an echo again. I don't know if you guys.
Which means it's probably my computer, so I will just turn my volume way down, so hopefully we won't get that feedback. Go on.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Brian, maybe try to.
I'm going to go to the headset. Okay.
Yes. So after all that,
Kelly, maybe
I have a satisfactory answer. Let me try this. How's that?
I think good.
That's better, worse? Oh, good. Okay, we'll try this. After all of that preamble, I'm not sure that I have that satisfactory of an answer to the question, because I think, Kristen, as you know, this is something that I have been more skeptical about and really struggled with, just given that, as I mentioned earlier, longitudinally, comparatively, you don't see huge differences here. I think the whole concept of deep canvassing, I think, holds promise. I think which is just the idea of these longer, repeated interactions with potential voters. But again, it raises the cost questions. I think Brian's work I've found to be some of the more compelling ideas in the space. It raises the same questions for me around the costs as internalized by the nonprofits participating. And then I guess one of this also touches back on the challenges question that you asked about earlier, Kristen. There's a lot of data that indicates that low propensity voters really don't understand the differences between the parties. And so I think deeper education about what the different platforms stand for is really important. And it can both help translate into greater engagement and turnout, but also helps people vote in ways that are more meaningful given their interests. And I have been, I'm always surprised, again, every time I see the data about how little people that don't typically vote know about the different party platforms. And so I think opportunities around engagement there are big, but costly.
Brian? Brian, do you want to offer some recommendations? Oh, I fear he can't hear us. Kelly, can you hear me?
I do. I hear you, Kristen.
Okay.
Here, let's give a hand signal.
Can you hear us? It's your turn.
Sorry, I dropped off for a second.
Great.
I was trying to switch to another mic, but go on. Hopefully this audio is okay. Do you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I apologize. I might not have heard everything that you had, Kelly. So hopefully, again, going back to your question, though, that you asked about what philanthropy can do specifically. And I think that was one of the things we talked about when we were getting ready for this call. And I think there's three basic things that we discussed that philanthropy can do. And this is a little different because I think and to be really clear, we're not talking about philanthropy doing anything fundamentally different, changing their mission, suddenly becoming a civic engagement funder. What we're talking about is funders who are funding hunger, funding environmental issues, who are funding housing issues, remaining a housing funder, an environmental funder, a health funder, but basically being more open to the fact that their grantees may do some voter engagement, civic engagement as part of that work. Again, we want to integrate this into the culture of nonprofits so that it's embedded in the way they operate, not just something one-off that happens, that parachutes in during election years. And so there were three things that we discussed, I know, when we were doing the preparation for this. The first of which is to look at the grant language that foundations have. A lot of foundations, for various reasons, have included language that unnecessarily or inadvertently confuses and limits what their grantees can do. And the Council on Foundations has a document that they worked with Rockefeller Brothers and Center for Lobbying in the Public Interest on. And I can share a link to that after this webinar that has some sample grant language and grant agreement language that gets around that. And what they basically argue is that many foundations mistakenly believe that they are legally required to state IRS lobbying and political activity restrictions. And in doing so, inadvertently confuse and intimidate their grantees. And so they have two solutions, one of which is just, you don't need to put it in your grant language. The only thing you could suffice it by simply having a line that says something to the effect of, all grant funds will be used solely for charitable, religious, scientific, and educational purposes as described in Section 170, et cetera, et cetera. But if folks feel like we do have to put something in there, then you can have a line that simply says something like, no funds may be used for partisan political activities, which are prohibited under 501c3. However, grantee may engage in unlimited nonpartisan voter education and engagement activities consistent with the law. And so I think, getting away from language that says you can't do any political activity, because a lot of folks don't know what political means, by being really clear that you can do nonpartisan voter engagement within the law, and trying to make sure your grant language does reflect that. And in some cases, a foundation could do more. They could actually proactively put in language that encourages their grantees. Ask them, hey, what are you doing to ensure your clients are civically engaged? A second thing that some funders are doing, we've been getting a lot of calls from different foundations around the country. Recently, we're doing one training in Georgia with the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta next month. We're working with a Native American funder out in California to do trainings for some of their grantees, where foundations can play a key role in distributing resources to their grantees about, here's the rules, here's what the laws say about staying nonpartisan. We love funding you. We love the work that you do. Here's some great resources that might help you do that work even better. Foundations can take that a step further and actually host webinars for their grantees. A lot of foundations, in addition to giving money, believe in building the capacity and offering resources to their grantees to go further. And a third action that we wanted to throw out on the table, or I wanted to throw out on the table, that foundations could do, is to actually be an active partner and lead by example. There's no reason a foundation can't themselves be a sponsor or sign up as a partner for things like National Voter Registration Day. I was looking through the partners from last year, and sure enough, there was a dozen or so foundations in that list already. Some of which, most of which I hadn't heard of, but there's at least a few of them that were the Andrew Goodman Foundation. I know them, but the Library Foundation of whatever county. And so there was a number of foundations in that list of sponsors for National Voter Registration Day. And in sponsoring it, in addition to showing that your foundation values civic engagement, you can also send that material out to your grantees, and they can know that this is something that they can do as a funder to support civic engagement among the grantees that they're working with.
Your line is now unmuted.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And thanks to Dan, who shared in the chat box a link to a great resource by a group called the California Civic Participation Funders. And a number of PACE members are involved in that effort. And they have done a look at effective civic engagement strategies, including voter engagement, integrated voter engagement in traditionally marginalized communities in California. So the link is in the chat box, and I'll also make it available on the video archive page when we're done with this discussion. Brian, if you can hear us, it looks like we lost your video. But I'd love to now open it up for questions from the group. So if folks want to unmute themselves and ask questions, you're welcome to do that. There is one question that came in privately on chat that I think is really, really great and important, particularly in this election. It says, I have heard tremendous anecdotal feedback that in this election in particular, voters and potential voters are disengaging because of the incivility they are witnessing. What are your thoughts on this, and how might philanthropy play a role in shifting the tone of the conversation to include non-traditional voting populations and less ideological voters? Kelly, do you want to start while we wait for Brian to come back? I don't know if you can hear us.
I'm happy to. Are you hearing an echo again? Okay, good. So I would say three things come to mind here. I think, and this is an issue that we've grappled with a lot. Political polarization was one of the initial sort of driving motivations for our strategy. So three things I would say. I think philanthropy is more uniquely incentivized to do something here. The parties, there is enough data suggesting to campaign managers that that basically to get people up into voting, you've got to push them out to the polls. So it's the more aggressive, sort of negative, anger-inducing kinds of messaging that people tend to think are most efficacious in getting people to vote. So the parties are incentivized to do that. And I think philanthropy, we've tested GOTV messages that have more benign calls behind them that say, did you know there's an election coming up? You should vote. Your voice should be heard, without a particular partisan or ideological push to it. So I think there are opportunities there, again, with the same caveat that most GOTV efforts tend to only get a couple of percentage points in turnout. Most of the other things that we've looked at are a few steps removed from voting, and I think necessarily have to be. I mean, this question of civility has so permeated the culture that solving it at the ballot box versus further upstream, I think, at the ballot box is harder. And there are a number of efforts on that front that we have looked at. Some things on the ground. There's a group called Living Room Conversations. There's a group called Faith and Politics in Texas. So there are a number of smaller groups. There's a group called All Sides that's trying to basically do a search engine that pulls up news media from the left and the right. So if you're Googling Syria, for example, instead of using Google, you could use All Sides, and it will pull up an ideological spectrum of news sources. There's a group called procon.org that tries to look at the pros and cons of various political issues. So there are a lot of groups that are looking at how to have more thoughtful and less sort of polarized and uncivil dialogue around issues, but they're not as directly tied to voting, and they face, I think, I'm a big fan of these. I should preface it by saying the challenges that I've wrestled with are ones around scale, obviously, and then also ones around preaching to the choir, and whether you're really, how hard it is to get the truly partisan ideologues to participate versus those that are sort of more naturally inclined to being moderate and open-minded. So I think the civility one is a really hard one.
Your line is now unmuted.
Brian, welcome back.
Thank you. I was actually hearing the audio there for a second.
Okay, great. So you heard the question around how do we encourage more civility so that we are engaging people who are less ideologically polarized or who might be disincentivized to participate due to the incivility they're seeing. Do you have a response to that one at all?
Yeah, and it's let me turn on. One of the things that I think could help, and I think one of the things we hope with is by bringing new voters, is one of the things that I would think, and I would argue that happens in voter turnout election. Hardline partisan. The people who are hardcore Republicans, they're voting in voter turnout elections. So if we can focus those who've been on the sideline, you look at non-voters, in their political views, and a little bit open to new voters. And so at least it's our group of non-voters. We can introduce them. So not everyone's so very at that point.
Brian, I think I got most of that, but we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. Can you try plugging in your headset and seeing if that works?
I will.
Great. Are there other questions from folks on the line that would like to unmute themselves and ask their questions live? We probably have time for one more. Okay. Well, some folks in the chat box have shared some additional resources, which are great. And again, we'll make those available on the website. I'm just scrolling through to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. One last call for questions. All right. Well, with that, I will thank our presenters and ask you both if there's any final words, thoughts, or reflections you'd like to leave us with today.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. I think what I would say is that, again, reiterating the point that I think Kelly brought up earlier, it's not a silver bullet for overall turnout, at least none we've found yet. But what we value and what we think is critically important is narrowing those voter participation gaps. And that is a place that nonprofits across the country are well positioned to have an impact on. And we hope that foundations can be more open to supporting their grantees doing this, integrating it into the work they're already doing, whether that's housing work, hunger work, or health work, or environmental work, as part of their day-to-day programs. And I'll work with you, Kristen, to make sure that the follow-up email includes some of the links to some of those resources, including the sample grant language from the Council on Foundations, the National Voter Registration link, and some of the other resources that I mentioned during the call.
Great. So for my part, I would say, first of all, there have been a couple questions about the literature base and the lit review I mentioned earlier, so happy to touch on those because it's a short answer. There is not something pulled together in a readily usable format. I think it would be a great opportunity for someone to do that. I can see if our lit review is very sloppy, but if I could clean it up and share it, that's specifically on registration. But our only way of getting these data have really been to reach out to universities that we fund and ask them to pull together what they think are the most effective articles on this front. So, Kristen, this could be something for you and I to talk about offline potentially. And then in terms of closing thoughts, I think for Hewlett's strategies and our focus on Congress, we've really struggled with where to engage on the voter turnout issue and how to do so meaningfully, given our particular interests. But I would say that I've been really intrigued and inspired by the work that Brian's been doing, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing how that evolves. And thank you for having us.
Your line is now unmuted.
Thank you to both of you for your participation in this thoughtful conversation, and to all of our attendees as well. Again, we'll make the video and many of the resources that were mentioned today available at pacefunders.org following the call. And we do these webinars every other month. So we'll have another one in September on a new topic. When you exit out of the webinar today, you'll receive a survey, and it gives you the opportunity to indicate topics that you would like to see PACE explore in the future. So don't hesitate to let us know. Many of the webinars that we have done have been in direct response to that kind of feedback that we have received. So again, thank you to Kelly and Brian. Thank you to everyone who joined the call today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.